Welcome, everyone. You're at Visionality's Building Forward, and our guest star today is Corey Pahanish, and he is the executive director of Teddy Bear Cancer. And we are here. You know the drill, right? We cover a big, meaty topic in 25 minutes or less. Um, we all have all the answers between us. And so if you've got lived experience or have a solution or have an answer, please hop on in the chat. You could use the raise your hand feature and we'll bring you on camera because we collectively have all the answers. So Corey, welcome as our guest star. And today what we're talking about is poverty and how poverty is the underserved elephant in the room, and how really no matter what your mission is, no matter what client base you're serving, you must have an awareness that poverty affects your mission and your clients. And so, Corey, you're certainly one of the best people I can think of to share on this topic. So talk to me, maybe generally or specifically within Teddy Bear, how you're seeing the way that poverty affects your clientele differently.
Well, first, thank you for having me. Our mission here at Teddy Bear is to advocate for families that are battling pediatric cancer on the Central Coast. And the way that we advocate is through raising awareness. And so anytime that we have an opportunity to discuss this topic, which impacts a lot of families each year, it's a blessing. So thank you again. And yeah, Teddy Bear, we serve families from all different socioeconomic backgrounds. But for those that don't know, the way that we do that is through our financial support, in which we offer direct financial services, aid, through our emotional support, as well as through our educational services. And so for our financial support, that's where we really do target families that are low to moderate income based on housing urban development guidelines that lay out those numbers for us. And the reason that we're very comfortable with targeting that particular population with our direct financial assistance is because we know that there is a cancer disparity and we're trying to close those gaps. So for those families, there's limited to no resources, which actually impacts the survival outcome of a child battling pediatric cancer when you look at it through a social determinant of health lens. So for example, we have, not to give too many details away, but we have a recently widowed mother that we're providing services to that has 3 children. And she was displaced from her home shortly after immigrating here from Mexico because of the treatment options that are offered here to save her child's life. So widowed mother, immigrated here, 3 children, and was displaced, was literally homeless. And she came to us when she found a small studio apartment that didn't have a stove, that didn't have a refrigerator, and had no furniture, including beds. So that's when that family was referred to us and didn't have next month's rent in 2023. There's when we talk about there's limited to no resources, there is no way that she can sort of level down to sort of free up some capital to provide the kind of resources that her child needs to survive this. And so that's where Teddy Bear would come in. Yeah.
So what you were saying there, just to clarify, is she's at what many would consider like the minimum, like a baseline, right? She doesn't have a home that she could sell and maybe move into a smaller home or an apartment or something
right.
like, right? She doesn't have a downsize option.
That's right. Yeah. And there's so many different layers to this, but just to stay on one particular topic in terms of the social determinant of health, what the research tells us is that, and while this might sound like common sense, nevertheless, it is an issue that is going unaddressed without organizations like Teddy Bear, which is it's really hard for a child to be able to recoup from some of these treatments when they're sleeping on the floor. The body needs a rest. And the body also needs nutritious food. So for a food insecure family that's living off of canned goods, that actually impacts the healing process for a child, makes it that much more complicated to be resilient when they're receiving chemotherapy. And for that particular family, if they don't have the transportation option or even gas to get to treatment at UCLA, then they skip treatment. So that's what we talk about when we're looking at this through a social determinant of health. It's the medical interventions are wildly important, but the interventions that we're providing too also increases the survivalship of the child, and that's why we target those particular families of those socioeconomic backgrounds with our direct financial assistance.
Well, you have such an interesting perspective at Teddy Bear, because so many organizations target poverty, right? They may be like a food bank or working with the unhoused population or the underhoused, or they're specifically targeting poverty. And cancer doesn't discriminate, right? There are kids of all kinds of socioeconomic backgrounds who have pediatric cancer. And so it's just such an interesting um shift in the lens. I mean, kind of the point is we all need to address poverty within our missions, whether it's specifically called out in the mission or not, because poverty does affect our outcomes.
Yeah, it's much like pediatric cancer doesn't discriminate. It's one of those things. Even when you're looking at my research is for my PhD dissertation, I studied the neurological, psychological, and behavioral consequences of financial burden. And even from a neurological perspective, it's completely rewiring the way that our brains operate. And so we are in this constant fight or flight. It's conditioned that's supposed to remain dormant. But when you're constantly conditioned to operate as if you're trying to anticipate threats, that actually has some pretty negative impacts on a person's health. And then the psychology to this is now you're in this constant state of anxiety. There's a lot of correlations between that and vulnerability to depression. And so when you take into those factors and then you add in there, now you've got a child with pediatric cancer. I mean, it completely compounds a family's ability to even survive, quite literally survive. Yeah.
Well, and just a colleague of ours, Carrie, she and I were talking, and she talked about how there's this sense of like not only measuring your own resources, but like your communal resources too. So like what is our collective safety net, right? And so that is such an interesting additional contributing factor, especially in the example that you brought up. Like if you're newly widowed, right, you're losing the support of a partner, you're losing someone to share the financial burden, the emotional burden, the work burden. But also you mentioned a new immigrant into our country, so even that, like when I tore my MCL, like my neighbor made me food, right? Because I know my neighbor. And so can you talk to me a little bit about what you see within your mission, on how like the one's own like network affects the outcomes?
Yeah. And sticking with this particular example, we did not provide interventions to this family alone. In fact, there's a new-ish nonprofit to Santa Barbara called Starfish Connection that we brought in as a partner that was able to actually offer rent support for this family as well. And I mean, you don't have to get too creative to think about what their journey would be like, that particular family, without Teddy Bear or without Starfish or without any of these other nonprofits. To your point, it's not like she came here with a built-in community. She was on her own. And so, yeah, this is like where when I think about even the emotional support that we're able to provide her and the other families, like we bring in an organization called FSA, and that's Family Service Agency, and they provide trauma-informed care to the families that are faced with this chronic distress that is the journey of pediatric cancer. And we outsource to our tutors that are providing tutoring to the child who's not only in treatment, but the siblings who become a part of the sort of the peripheral, if you will, because the mother or the family is so hyper focused on the child in treatment. So yeah, I mean, it's that sort of age old takes a village, but quite literally it's taking a village. I mean, even the amount of financial aid that we're able to provide families that are initially qualified between $5,000 and $7,500 all the way up to $17,000. While that is a transformational amount for a family, it is not enough. I mean, the data, yeah, I was doing some research in preparation for this, and I saw everywhere from $500,000 to $800,000 for the cost of the pediatric cancer journey. So, I mean, that it's not enough. And even as grateful as our families are, I will speak on behalf of them and say that two things can coexist at once. We're grateful for your investment right now in our pediatric cancer survivor journey, but it is not enough. And so, yeah, I mean, it's we have a whole dream big philosophy here, and don't think we haven't had conversations around how do we close that gap? How do we potentially have an endowment that could provide 500 to 800,000 per family in their journey so that we can move them from surviving to thriving?
Well, that's such an interesting, such an interesting, big goal of yeah, our goal is not for you to just survive this, but could Teddy Bear and your partner agencies play a role in actually fundamentally changing the makeup of a family, and they actually end up, better at the end because they have discovered community. I love
Yeah.
it.
Amen.
I love it. So we have a question in the chat. Thank you. Please go ahead and put questions in the chat or raise your hand if you want to come on camera. So the question is, when you are living in poverty, traumatized, and not a native speaker, it must be so difficult to advocate for yourself and your family. So I'm curious what kinds of examples you see within Teddy Bear, and how y'all adjust your services to accommodate all the different needs that you address.
Yeah, and the evidence strongly supports the link between chronic stress-related damage as a consequence of residing in low-income neighborhoods and what our families in this low to socioeconomic status are dealing with daily. So the residents that are in low-income neighborhoods in particular are exposed to relentless hazards, and they include a variety of risks. And so that's high population density, noise, crime, pollution, discrimination, poor access to resources. And so these hazards are something that our families are already enduring on a daily basis. So yeah, now you throw in there that someone is not English proficient. The navigation of the hospitals themselves, I've had to do this, and it can be daunting. We've heard experiences where, and this goes out to all my language justice allies out there, where a hospital, a doctor is diagnosing a child's having pediatric cancer, and the child is the only one that speaks English in the room, so they're having to translate their diagnosis to their families. Yeah, I know. And so, yeah, it's the trauma is relentless. It's relentless, and
unimaginable. And
yeah,
I'm curious too, there's this whole incorrect belief in nonprofit land where it's like, well, for $1, how many X can you fix, right? For one, I want the biggest bang for my dollar, right? So can $1, I don't know, save one puppy? Um, taking not taking into account that the hardest to achieve missions cost more, right? So as you add on these like complicating factors, they cost more, and it is like the most important work to like do the hardest to reach missions. So I'm curious, from an executive director perspective, how do you communicate that to your donors or to your board? Because it quote unquote looks bad on paper because we're, the cost to support one family might be higher, but it's really the most critical work.
Yeah, I see what you're doing here. You get me all riled up. I share this passionately with you. Um, we had the opportunity to work with this great consulting firm called Visionality on a number of projects, including a feasibility study in which our partner agencies and our families and donors have all identified our staff as being necessary to our mission. And when you sit down and you are really like investing yourself into inquiry with our families, they're very clear that the connection that they make with our staff accentuates the healing process. You have an ally in this, someone that you trust. It's exhausting and fatiguing to have to tell this story of your child having cancer over and over again to a new staff member or supporter on your journey. I mentioned that as an introduction to your prompt because it makes it that much more important for staff retention. And the data is extraordinarily clear. Make no bones about it. This is hard work. It's also hard work, and people need to do more than just survive. The staff that I have here, and the reason that we're pursuing becoming a trauma-informed, resilient, and healing institution is because our staff are exposed to chronic, and not just the subject matter, but the distressing content within it on a daily basis.
Yeah.
And so imagine you're leaving your job and now you're going home paycheck to paycheck and trying to exist, survive on the Central Coast because you're not making livable wages. And so, well, that costs money. And I promise you, and I know I've heard you beat this drum too, and the data doesn't lie. Attrition is so costly. So if you're investing in an organization, you should probably pull back that curtain a little bit and see what their retention rates are. Because for me, if you really want to stretch $1, it's not that here's your $1. Did you turn it into $1.50 this year? It is a long-term investment. So look at this from like a longitudinal investment where you're just like, okay, here's my $1. Is this really getting stretched over time? And one way to look at that, a lens of looking at that is through a lens of retention. It costs tens of thousands of dollars of administrative overhead costs, okay, to have to rehire someone to train them up. And then just the kind of disruption that creates of attrition, of having to constantly be a professional plate spinner amongst staff if you're trying to pull other absent now employees' weights. I mean, it has an absolute cost it impacts your bottom line. This is not a debate.
Yeah.
This is true.
And what I'm hearing is in a measurable way, it impacts your outcomes. So it's just like such a lovely, clear line to say that, once again, poverty plays a role on how well Teddy Bear can achieve its mission, even from the staff perspective. Because if the staff is existing in some level of poverty or insecurity, they will be forced to look at different opportunities, or they may still show up, but what quality of work, especially when it's really heart forward work, can you provide when your cup isn't full yourself, when you're worried about how you're going to fill your tank up with gas to get to work tomorrow? Like, that's just not a place where you can do the kind of work that you guys do every day.
Yeah, we've been very intentional in addressing attrition, which was a problem here at one point, losing a staff member every 3 months for 6.5 years, which did cost a lot of money. And now in my third year, I feel very comfortable that with the retention that we've managed to reclaim here at Teddy Bear. And I'm mentioning this not as an ego stroke or a humble brag. I'm mentioning this because I can tell you very clearly that there's a not a dot connection, a very direct line between the financial success that we've had in our fundraising, which goes directly to our families. We're able to offer, it's not that we're able to, we are offering more financial aid than ever before. We're offering new innovative programs that are family centric. And we're raising that much more money because now we're in this, we've gotten in, there's continuity here. We're in a rhythm,
Yeah.
and our donors are seeing familiar faces. There's a trust there. There's that moves management theory of building trust with donors, building relationships, not looking at them as transactional, but looking at them through a transformational relationship. Well, that takes time to build. And a familiar face and the ability to tell the story of our mission. That takes time. You don't just do that right out of the gate. You got to spend time with our families. You got to draw that inspiration from them. Otherwise, people will see right through that. So yeah, no, it's not this is not a debate anymore. It is settled science that is critically important to make sure that when we're looking at the pie chart of expenditures at nonprofits, that we're not just looking at an individual slice and saying like, oh, their overhead is X amount. There's a story to that. And as a donor, and I am myself, I want to know what that story is. I don't want to just make assumptions that, the staff shouldn't be making livable wages. I want to make an assumption that is from dialogues with the nonprofit, and I want to hear them say we are invested in our staff in the long term. We prioritize retention and in a healthy working culture and environment, because I know that is the ultimate investment I want to make.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, and what do you mean you don't want to pay for overhead? Like, you don't go to the grocery store and say like, I don't want to pay for the lights. Like, I'm buying this apple, but like take out the lights. Like, you can't buy the apple without the lights. So anyway, you and I can soapbox on this forever. But I've got another question, if you'll allow me, from the chat.
Sure, yeah.
Teddy Bear and similar nonprofits sit in the integral seat of addressing the stigma of poverty and saying this support is not enough when families aren't empowered to say it themselves. Can you speak to that stigma and the advocacy challenge that Teddy Bear faces?
Sure. Yeah. And this is something that I apologize ahead of time. I promise that my immediate making it about me is just an introduction to my point, which is this is something that I have a personal relationship with, is growing up, widowed mother, in and out of cars, just south of Detroit. It had an absolute impact on our quality of life. And there's also a direct correlation between having that kind of disequilibrium and chaos in the home and the fact that I graduated 361st out of 367 students with a 1.4 GPA. So becoming a first gen was not on my radar. So I can speak to this directly. And I also know, in terms of having to exist within communities that aren't experiencing poverty, that there is a projection onto us. There's all sorts of micro and macro aggressions that we were experiencing and enduring. My mother cleaned homes at times for added income. And yeah, I mean, I just remember seeing, because my mom didn't have money for childcare, she would take me with her. So I saw the dynamic firsthand in being treated as less than, as if we're not equals because of our socioeconomic status. I've seen my mom, and my mom is not, God bless her. I mean, hey, we're missing, some earrings. I'm just curious. I've experienced that. I've experienced being placed in special ed because I couldn't focus in class because I didn't eat the night before. And I've experienced what that's like to have to walk through a food line and give them essentially what's a food stamp to get my food and to be made fun of and bullied. So I know this firsthand the difference between the threshold of my experience and the families that we're serving is we didn't have pediatric cancer in our home. And there's a lot of other variables to this. My mother was fluent in English and we did have some extended families and friends that we could lean on if need be. So for our families that we serve, it's like all of those nuances. It's their own unique story, by the way. I don't want to rebrand their story as mine. There's a lot of different nuances that our families are enduring and experiencing that can be suffocating. And then when you add in there the pediatric cancer diagnosis, because again, it's not as if there's like turn to page 35 in your how to do life so you can see how to navigate pediatric cancer. No one ever woke up in the morning thinking, oh, today is the day that my child's going to be diagnosed with cancer. Thank God we prepped for this. I mean, it just takes a family out. It takes them off their legs. It knocks them out. And at the same time, they don't have the luxury of then sleeping in the next day. They have to wake up that much earlier if they even get sleep to have to figure out now what the next steps are. So, I think it's the shock. I think it's just the sheer shock of it. Because on the other end of that shock is I could possibly lose my child.
And if I don't find a way to put gas in my car, I'm more likely to lose my child, and that's my fault because I didn't XYZ 1, 2, 3. And my goodness, Corey, yikes.
Yeah, there is too. I mean, I don't want to pull back to the curtain too far in some of the intimate conversations I've had with our families, but I will tell you what you're alluding to now with respect to there is even a level of guilt, the sheer emotions. There is a grieving process that happens that our families are experiencing. And just that it's messy. This is humanities stuff. This is also too why it's so important for us to provide those emotional support and those trauma-informed therapeutic interventions into our families too, because it disrupts partnerships and unions, relationships between caretakers and children, and so on and so forth. It's just chronic distress. Yeah.
Well, and Teddy Bear Teddy Bear is about the family, right? Because pediatric cancer, of course, affects the individual who is diagnosed, but every member of the family is affected by that diagnosis. And one of my favorite stories that I hear about Teddy Bear is how sometimes, the siblings would come to the office to do homework. And the staff would sit with, this is not their job, right? The fundraising professional is going to sit with a kiddo and help them do their math homework. Like that is not in the job description. And that is completely core to the mission of Teddy Bear to do these wraparound family services.
Yeah, I'd be doing a disservice if I didn't give a shout out to our founder and community icon, Nikki Katz, because this is why it's so important for us as we grow to make sure that we do not forget our roots, that we stay absolutely connected to them, acknowledge them. They need to be involved and intertwined in our entire existence and everything that we do, because she did have this motto of whatever it takes, because whatever it takes is needed for the child to survive.
And it's different for every family because every family has different resources available to them. Like y'all don't have the luxury of this is how we solve this problem, because every challenge is different.
Yeah, well, and I see us inching toward our time boundary here, not to take us down a whole rabbit hole, but once again, and circling back to your point earlier, which is there's no cookie cutter approach. This is not something where it's like, yeah, this family got diagnosed, we'll take it from here. We don't even need to hear from you. This oftentimes what happens is when a family is referred to us, to our programs team, that relationship is so critical because now that trust is being built, that vulnerability and actually really coming and being transparent and candid with our programs team, that's where you really start to see the nuances of what this family requires right now. That is not something that they just come out and say right up front. Oftentimes, they don't even necessarily know what it is that they need. They just know that there's like the financial need. They know that they don't want their kid to fall behind academically. They know that they're experiencing something extraordinarily emotionally distressing. And the other piece too, before we close, I want to mention, because oftentimes it gets overlooked and it's unfortunate, which is this is extraordinarily dispiriting too. There's an existential crisis within the family. And so, if for anybody that looks at Teddy Bear and you see things like our holiday campaign, so around the holidays when we deliver gifts, when I talk about dispiriting, I suppose the other side of that is this does lift their spirits. And when I say that, and I can even look at this through a scientific lens, what I mean by spirits is they feel connected to a norm, something bigger than themselves in that moment that gets them out of that survival mode. So that normalcy is something that they have an absolute appetite for, but they don't necessarily know how to address it. So for us to come there and to deliver gifts, not only to the kids, but even to the families as well, has such a deep spiritual impact on that family that is also critical to their journey.
Yeah, I love that. I love it. I actually want to invite one of my colleagues on. She put a really lovely statement in the chat. So I'm going to introduce my colleague Lynette. She's a co-consultant of ours. We've worked on lots of clients together. So Lynette, why don't you recap what you put in the chat, because it was just so lovely.
Oh, thanks. And Corey and I have had the opportunity to meet a few times. And I have to say, I was starting to tear up a little because some of the things you were saying brought me right back to my childhood. I didn't grow up with pediatric cancer in a family. I grew up with my dad having kidney disease due to a workplace accident. And overnight, I don't remember a healthy dad. So somewhere in my psyche, things changed. I don't remember a healthy dad. What I do remember is spending many days in the hospital while my dad went through 2-3 kidney transplants, lost his life, came back to life, like all this stuff that went on. And then my dad not being able to work, a lawsuit, being filmed by lawyers to see if my dad really was healthy, but he couldn't hold a job because he had to go to dialysis every other day, 3 days a week for the rest of his life. Who's going to hire a person like that? So then my mom, with her $10 an hour bookkeeping job, trying to help us survive. And so we had I never want to ever smell dried milk again, right? We grew up on the dried milk, and we grew up with my dad figuring out how to pull a meal together with what we had. And with all of that said, we still had lots of privilege, right? My parents owned a home. We were a white, lower to middle class family. And so I had, youth organizations that helped us, and 4-H was a big part of my life, and normalcy was very important. But it just resonates so much with what you said personally, how I grew up that way and what we had to do. And I think you're right about the social consequences, right? Like I remember the Christmas that all of our friends were getting all these gifts, and my parents got us each one gift. My brother and I each got one gift under the tree. That's what they could afford. And we were those kids going, oh, darn it, we don't understand. Yeah. We don't understand why our friends were getting the clothes and the sandals and the records and all of that, and we were getting one gift. And it took my parents all year to save for that gift. So that's the personal side. And then on the professional side, it really resonated with me. At Coverly Pro, we're a marketing and PR firm. We work a lot with Visionality and with others. And I think about our housing trust fund client here in Ventura County. I think about public transit. We have a few public transit clients. And one of the things we talk about with housing affordability is really making sure we tell people stories and making sure that it's so much more than making sure the audience, the donors, and the community understands that it's so much more than putting a roof over someone's head. It's the social services. I think about a development that is going up in Ojai that you both may be aware of, Mesa Farm. Fascinating project where it's helping transitional age youth who find themselves waking up one day as you're an adult and you've grown up in the foster care system and go on, now, and I'm not saying that the nonprofits that help transitional age youth turn their backs on, because they don't, but how do they transition? And so Mesa Farm is helping with that, right? So, and with that comes teaching them job skills, right? health, right? And making sure health is in order, sustainable growing in this case. But I just think I said in the chat that the collective prosperity is what enables a community to thrive. So when we help, and then when you compound all of that with pediatric cancer, I just can't even imagine not having the resources, or not, as you said earlier, coming into a community that you don't even speak the language and figuring out how to get to those resources. What do I do? We work with many mansions, and we interviewed quite a few residents, and one resident, Rosa, she said that I now have a stable place where my children can play safely in the playground. There's a study group, and I can for my children to study and be helped with computers that I would not be able to afford. And oh, by the way, because of all of that, I got a raise at my job that I walk to every day. And now I am collectively prospering and helping our community. Full circle.
Completely full circle. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I didn't know that about your story. Thank you for sharing that, Lynette. Appreciate that.
I'll have to send you the poem my dad wrote one night when it was a rough night. But yeah, people, and that's the thing, you were talking about our stories. Like, I remember speaking in front of high school students who were on the cusp of being in high school, if you follow me, and it was part of the chamber's principal for a day thing. And when I spoke to them, they really judged me because I showed up in a Camry and I was a white woman, and I sat down, I said, let's collect ourselves, and they targeted me. Where do you live? How much do you make? What? And I had to be vulnerable and say, look, let me tell you what I earned, and let me also tell you the privilege I have in getting there. But I think you have to be very authentic in who you are and share your story so that people know where you come from and why you do what you do.
Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
My friend, final thoughts?
Final thoughts. I really appreciate this time. This is really kind of you. And, back to that whole takes a village. Visionality has been instrumental in our success. And when I say our success, I mean our enabling us to give our families that much more that they need in order to survive this pediatric cancer journey, put them in a stronger position to thrive. So when I say thank you, I don't just mean for this opportunity to raise awareness, but also for everything else that you all have been doing behind the scenes with us. It is a blessing. Really do appreciate you.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. And I appreciate you. We didn't really talk a lot about the doctoral work that you do, but I just want to say I appreciate you it's such an interesting perspective to bring data and science into nonprofit land. That isn't really our roots, but I think it's our future, and I think you're part of that future.
Thanks. Yeah, no, it's important to make sure that we're paying very close attention to the patterns and the best practices and the core competencies, and a lot of that stuff we can tease out from what the data is telling us.
Data.
So
there are answers. It is measurable.
It's measurable.
Start measuring it and be more efficient.
Amen.
All right, my friend. Thank you so much. I appreciate you.
Thank you so much. Take good care.
Right. You too.
Bye.